All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. We're a few minutes past 3:30. So hey everyone, welcome again to the Emancipatory Education Speaker Series sponsored by the SJSU Lurie College of Education and Division of Student Affairs. My name is Brian. I'm just here to get you all situated today before we get started and let you know that a recording of this event will be available afterward at the same link where you RSVP'd. Captions and ASL interpreters are available in this webinar today as well. So if you'd like captions, you can select the captioning button in your Zoom toolbar on the bottom of your window. As those of you who are attending, your video and audio are automatically turned off, so you don't have to worry about being visible in the webinar today. Please use the chat to communicate with one another and communicate with our panelists. And today's speakers will answer questions after their remarks. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to our Dean, Heather Latimer.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us here today. So as you can see from the statement on the screen, this is after a year of hard conversations, important conversations. We adopted this statement last year around our strategic plan and where we wanted to go and who we want to be as a college. And for those who don't know, the College of Education has about 2,000 students, both 1,000 undergrad and about 1,000 graduate students. And we committed to this idea of preparing transformative educators, counselors, therapists, school and community leaders through an emancipatory work across our scholarship, our research, our teaching, and our service. And as part of that, we are working to create an Institute for Emancipatory Education. And one of the conversations there is how do we engage in the larger community around what it means to be emancipatory in our educational practice. So we conceived of this speaker series as a way to think about coming back from COVID. Everyone talks about wanting to come back to normal, and certainly we all want to be out of these Zoom boxes. But the question really was, what's the normal that we want to go back to? Because we knew that normal did not work for too many of our families, too many of our students, too many of our communities. So we conceived of this as a time to come together with that question. What is the normal? What is the approach? What is the reality that we want to return to in this post-COVID world? The importance of this conversation was brought into heightened reality this last week with the events that we saw in Atlanta and the ensuing conversations or lack thereof, the anti-Asian violence, white supremacy, and misogyny that coalesced into horrific acts of violence and oppression, not only mass murder, but also statements from law enforcement that dehumanized victims and seemed to excuse the atrocities of a murderer. And so this conversation seems particularly important today, and I am so grateful to have Dr. E.J.R. David, Saili Kulkarni, Tiny Gray Garcia, and Leroy Moore here to engage in this larger conversation with us. Dr. David sent us his title a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I guess it was just last week. And the title is Emancipatory Education, Healing the Damages of a Sick World. And that seems particularly relevant today. So I am very grateful to them, and I'm grateful to all of you for being in this space here at the end of a very long week to think about what is it that our role is as educators, as members of society, as members of community, to heal the realities of a sick world, healing the damages of a sick world through an emancipatory education lens. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend, Dr. Virginia Lowe Hagan, who is the founding faculty director of the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Resource Center at San Diego State, our sister institution, and was the one who helped to make the connection with Dr. David, and a longtime friend, an amazing person, a great author of children's books. If you haven't looked them up, I would encourage you to check out the books that she's written, because they are powerful and important, not only for children, but for adults as well. So with that, I will hand it to Virginia.
Thank you so much. Oh gosh, there are so many things that I can say about Dean Heather Latimer. You are also lucky to have her here. Thank you so much for this. This is so wonderful. You've done such amazing work. So kudos to Dean Latimer. But I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. E.J. Ramos David to your series, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to do that. He was born in the Philippines. He is a psychology professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage and has authored several books and articles. I want to note some notable books of his because they have great titles: Brown Skin, White Minds, Internalized Oppression, The Psychology of Oppression, and We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet. He is an expert on Asian American Pacific Islander and Filipinx American psychological issues, especially around colonial mentality and its psychological implications. He is recognized for his significant contributions to the field of racial and ethnic minority psychology. He is a much sought after voice and champion of and for the Filipinx American community. He's received many awards and accolades for his work. He's such a great friend and thought partner for San Diego State University. We have featured him as part of our Filipinx American History Month programming, and we will also be featuring him at our upcoming APITA conference addressing COVID impacts on the APITA communities, taking place on April 3rd and April 10th, and all are invited. I would love to have our San Jose State friends come as well. I have no doubt that San Jose State will love him as much as we do, and I'm thrilled to be sharing him with you all. As long as the San Diego State University APITA Center remains, Dr. David, as long as we remain your favorite CSU, I'm fine sharing you with the College of Ed at San Jose State. So without further ado, Dr. David.
Hey everyone, can you all see my screen? Great. Okay. Well, first of all, good afternoon to you all. My name is E.J.R, and I am thrilled to be here with all of you. Thank you to Dean Heather Latimer and the rest of the San Jose State University College of Education for putting the speaker series together. And thanks to Virginia for that intro and for connecting me with all of you. I also want to thank Brian Chung Dooley for helping me get set up and for coordinating everything. I really appreciate that. Again, thank you all for inviting me to share some of my thoughts on this topic. It's a great honor to share the space with all of you and to be on the same speaker lineup with super amazing people. To all of you who are tuned in, thank you for choosing to spend some of your time with us. I deeply appreciate your time. As you can see, I want to share some of my thoughts about what emancipatory education should strive for. But before I do that, as I do with every talk, I must first do some acknowledgements. First, I want to acknowledge my ancestors. Although I identify as Filipino, as it is what is most familiar to many people, Filipino really is a colonial name. The peoples in the lands now known as the Philippines are very diverse. There are many ethnic and cultural groups throughout the islands. My ancestors are specifically Kapampangan and Tagalog. They are people of the riverbanks and people of the river. And it is them who I must acknowledge, and it is them who are with me today. I also must acknowledge my family. My wife is Koyukon Athabaskan from the village of Ruby by the Yukon River. Together we have 4 children, Malakas, Kalayaan, Kaluguran, and Tala. There she is, our most recent addition. Even though you don't see them here with me, you see them through a drawing right there, I guess, in the background. Even though they're not here physically with me, they're always with me, just like my ancestors. I am a reflection of them, just like I am a reflection of my ancestors. And so I really want to acknowledge them. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that I am joining you all from the traditional lands of the Dinaina people. Its name is Degayakak, otherwise known as Anchorage. It is here where I live and work. All right, so in my 20 minutes with you all, I want to share some of my thoughts for what emancipatory education should be. There are many changes that need to be made, many ideas for what emancipatory education must look like. And the brilliant speakers in this series have shared amazing thoughts and visions regarding this topic already. What I plan to do today is to humbly share some of my thoughts to supplement theirs. My thoughts about emancipatory education is not meant to be definitive, as I see our efforts toward it as a process, an active and ongoing process. And I still really see that we are, still figuring this out, hopefully together. I also want to preface my presentation with a disclaimer that my training is not in education. And I'm not an expert on education, pedagogies, and theories. I'm a psychologist, as Virginia and Dean Latimer mentioned, specifically a psychological scientist that looks at the mental health effects of colonialism and contemporary forms of oppression. I also want to preface this with the fact that my work is deeply influenced by my own personal experiences. Therefore, what I will share with you all here today is a reflection of these factors. My training as a psychological scientist and my personal experiences as a Filipino-American immigrant with a family who are indigenous to these lands. All right, so let's get started. As you can probably guess right here with the title, I see emancipatory education as education that is healing. However, before I talk about what that might look like, it's important for me to first talk about the damages that we're trying to heal and where those damages stemmed from. So these three underlined words will serve as the outline of my presentation today. I will talk to you all about what I mean by a sick world and the damages it has created and how we can heal from such damages. Let's start with what I mean by sick world. I was born in the Philippines. I grew up in a context where light skin was admired, English was valued, and indigenous peoples were regarded as uncivilized savages. And the education I received reinforced and perpetuated these inferiorizing and dehumanizing messages. I grew up in a context where English fluency is regarded as an indicator of intelligence, and where people who cannot speak English are regarded as lower class and stupid. It is a context where everything that was made in the USA is valued and associated with better quality, while anything local or made in the Philippines is regarded as cheap, of poor quality, and only for the poor. I grew up in a context surrounded by many relatives and friends and teachers and elders and other authority figures who always talked about ways to make their skin color lighter, or at least ways to prevent their skin from getting too dark. Many of them used bleach or skin whitening soap on a daily basis. Some even used IV drips today to make their skin lighter. I grew up in a context where people were so afraid to get dark that they seem afraid of the sun, so afraid that they would not come out of their homes until the sun is already beginning to set. I grew up in an Americanized educational system where English was used for teaching, where I was taught that Spain discovered and civilized us, and the United States liberated us, where I was inculcated with American values and ideals, where I was taught that America was the land of milk and honey, that America was the promised land, and where I was taught that anything American is better than anything Filipino. Education has been the tool that erased my peoples and our ways, our worldviews, and our ways of doing things. Education was the tool through which my people's bodies and cultures were inferiorized. Education was the tool through which my people's minds were colonized. The reward system in colonial Philippines were designed to be pro-white, and this reward system still exists today. For Filipinos, our survival, our success depended on how much we understood and adopted whiteness. And so before I and many other Filipino immigrants like me, before we even got to the US, we have already been educated and socialized for generations to be pro-white. Pro-whiteness has been normalized and it's deeply, deeply ingrained. And for generations now, for centuries, we've been educated and socialized to believe that being pro-white is necessary to succeed, to advance, to move up. Then I came to this country, and my education in the US did not challenge the miseducation I received in the Philippines. But this is not surprising. The US was founded on stolen indigenous lands and was built on the backs of enslaved Black people. This country was founded on the myth of white supremacy. So it's not surprising that the institutions in this country, especially the educational institutions, reflect white supremacy. White supremacy is the air that this country breathes. So it's not surprising then that people who are trying to be a part of this country, like me and other immigrants, end up breathing this air of white supremacy. It's almost inevitable. The reward system in this country is designed to reward people for being pro-white. In this country, pro-whiteness is required to succeed, and many of us have come to believe that pro-whiteness is required to survive. So yeah, pro-whiteness is part of the Americanization process. And many people, especially peoples of color, especially immigrants of color, have succumbed to this. And to me, this is the saddest, most insidious effect of this oppressive world. This is what I mean by a sick world. So what are the damages of this sick world? So the research on how oppression affects peoples of color and other historically oppressed groups is clear. Oppression can lead to poor mental health, trauma, poor self-esteem, lower life satisfaction, substance use, suicidal ideation. But oppressed peoples don't just deal with the racism or other types of oppression that we directly experience. We are also forced to deal with the oppressive experiences that our friends and family face. But not only that, we also feel the oppressive experiences faced by other people who, we might not even know, but still look like us, or, we have a shared identity with. So if we see someone who look like us treated badly, that vicarious oppression affects us too. When we see on TV how our people are dehumanized and othered and inferiorized or terrorized or murdered, we feel that. It activates our fight or flight systems too. It makes us anxious, stressed out, maybe even scared, maybe even depressed too. We lose sleep because of that too. So we don't need to directly experience oppression to be negatively affected by it. And to take this concept of vicarious oppression even further, the oppressive experiences of our ancestors also affect us today. Historical trauma and its effects can be passed down to later generations. There's emerging epigenetic research that supports this. So all of those historical experiences of racism, of colonialism, of imperialism that regarded our communities as savages, as uncivilized, as inferior, those messages that damaged and messed up our ancestors, they can still inflict damages on us today, several generations later. And many of us have internalized these oppressive messages and have succumbed to them. Many of us have come to accept and believe that our peoples are indeed inferior. So today, many of us might feel ashamed or embarrassed of our ethnicities. Many of us might feel ashamed of our darker skin. Many of us might use skin whitening products or straighten our hair. Many of us might look down on other people in other communities or in our own communities, be hostile to them, inflict violence on those who we think are not Americanized enough. We call them fobs. We make fun of their accents, and we regard them as backwards or less intelligent. Many of us might even get to the point where we minimize the oppressive experiences that we face, thinking that such oppression is okay because at least we're here, and that we should just work harder on our accents, work harder on our math homework, work harder on our jobs, work harder on being American, just work harder on becoming white so that we can avoid racism. Many of us have become convinced that the closer that we are to whiteness, then the better off we will be. And as I mentioned earlier, many of us have come to believe that our success and even our survival depended on how much we understood and adopted whiteness. So sure, right, the damages of living in a sick, oppressive world include mental health consequences, psychological distress, trauma, low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, substance use, even suicide. But the effects of living in an oppressive world also include loss of culture, loss of pride, loss of connection to our ancestors, loss of identity, loss of who we are, loss of connection with our peoples, therefore putting us in a very vulnerable position to replace what was our own with what white people tell us is better, putting us in a very vulnerable position to accept white supremacy. And so now that we've covered the damages brought on by a sick, oppressive world, let's get to a discussion of what kind of education can help us heal these damages. To me, emancipatory education means a healing education. It's education that corrects for the injustices and harms done, including the harms done by education itself. And the education must heal or free or liberate the individual, but not just the individual. The education must also heal or fix a broken, sick society. And for education to be healing, for it to be emancipatory, I think it needs to facilitate 4 kinds of connections. Y'all remember this game? It's Connect 4. I'm about to share 4 important connections, so I thought a picture of Connect 4 is a good visual. But anyway, so the first connection that I want to talk about is we must connect the oppressive past with the oppressive present. A healing education is one that connects the violent, oppressive, and traumatic systems established in the past, such as during colonialism and slavery, to modern structures and systems and ways of doing things, the systems we still have today and still operate in today. A healing education must help people understand that Jim Crow and slavery is still very much alive in our modern day policing, in our justice system, in our jails. A healing education must help people see that the anti-immigrant sentiments and policies that we see today, like the Muslim ban, regarding immigrants as job stealers or virus carriers or whatever else, these sentiments and policies are the same as those in the past. And another timely example that COVID put a spotlight on is the fact that Filipino nurses dominate the nursing profession in this country, therefore putting them and their families at higher risk for getting infected by the coronavirus and dying because of the coronavirus. Well, the reason for this is colonialism, and that the US established Americanized schools in the Philippines that evolved into Americanized nursing schools in the US because of its exploitation and wars, left the Philippine economy in a fragile state, setting up the Philippines in such a way that people must leave in order to survive. And so structurally, many Filipinos end up having to come to the United States in order to survive, while simultaneously draining the Philippines its own most valuable resource, its people. Another timely example is what happened in Atlanta a couple of days ago, where a white man murdered Soon Park, Hyun Grant, Sun Cha Kim, Xiao Ji Tan, Dao Yo Feng, Yong Yu, Delaney Ashley Young, and Paul Andre Michaels. This tragedy has put many, not just one, but put many exclamation points on the fact that anti-Asian violence has been on the rise over the past year. But anti-Asian racism isn't new. Anti-Asian racism is very much an American tradition. This has been going on for at least 150 years, since the Page Act of 1875 banned Chinese women from immigrating to the US because they were seen as prostitutes and disease carriers, to the colonialism of the Philippines in the late 1800s, to the assaults, murders, and bombings of Filipino farmers in the early 1900s by white terrorists, to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, to the imperialist wars in the Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Korea that killed millions of Asians, to the United States military bases established in Asian countries, where American soldiers exploited, sexualized, and objectified Asian women, acting like they're entitled to have control over Asian bodies, to the Muslim ban, to the mass murders at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, to the biases, stereotypes, and hate crimes that Asian Americans are experiencing recently. Anti-Asian racism is an American tradition. White supremacist violence against Asian Americans is not new. In fact, it is white supremacist violence that brought many of us here as colonized peoples, as refugees, and as immigrants trying to survive because the United States have ravaged and exploited our homelands. So making historical and contemporary connections, as painful as it might be, is healing because it connects us with our ancestors, their struggles, their fights, their resiliencies. Making these connections can help us address many of the damages of this sick world, like identity confusion, lack of connection with our peoples, loss of culture, low self-esteem, low pride, and feelings of inferiority. So this is the first connection. Let's now move on to number 2. Oops. We must connect oppressive environmental social factors with individual and community issues. We as a westernized society have a tendency to prioritize and put more weights on intra-individual factors, things that are inside of us, like genes, our biology, even our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, individual level factors. And this is a direct result of the dominance of Western worldviews, as it is a reflection of Western values and emphasis on individuality, on elemental thinking, and breaking things down to separate parts. So the way that we tend to understand and address issues in our society is to identifying and modifying parts or factors or processes that are inside of us. But we know that even the most basic intra-individual factors and processes are influenced by our environment. And for historically oppressed groups, this is especially important because many of our concerns don't exist because of us or because of something within us. Our problems are not because of something inherent about us or because of internal processes. What's wrong is not inside us. Our suffering isn't because of something inherent about us or inherent about our community. This tendency to problematize our being and our peoples is very colonial. This tendency to make our bodies and our worldviews and our cultures, our ways of life as the problem is very colonial. And our problems and our struggles exist because of oppressive environments. So we must look at extra individual factors, historical factors, colonialism, neo-colonialism, racism, other forms of oppression. We must go beyond our westernized way of thinking and our focus on individual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and shift our focus toward oppressive systems. And as an example of how we tend to emphasize internal factors, let me share with you all some of my thoughts on resilience. But again, just to be clear, I think resilience is a good thing. It is a strengths-based construct that can be empowering because it reminds people and communities that they are strong. However, an oversimplified conceptualization of this construct as an intra-individual factor, especially among historically oppressed groups, is dangerous because it can lead to blaming people for the problems or the issues that they face. This is a subtle, perhaps even benevolent or well-intentioned type of victim blaming. By conceptualizing resilience simply as an intra-individual factor, we can fall into the trap of telling people who struggle that all they need to do is to be more resilient. And if they don't succeed, it is simply because they are not resilient enough. Resilience has become victim blaming 2.0. And besides, I'm not even sure why resilience became so popular. This issue, is surprising to me because the problem is not our resilience. The question should not be whether we are resilient or not, or how we can be more resilient. We have already proven our resilience for generations, over and over again. We don't need to keep proving how resilient we are. The world needs to stop oppressing us. So the problem, again, is not our resilience. The problem is a world that constantly requires our resilience. And again, our resilience is not permission for our continued oppression, even though that's what's been happening. So internal factors are not the problem. Oppression is. And to me, education that is healing is the type of education that helps people rid themselves of self-blame. Education that is healing helps people see that the true source of their difficulties and struggles do not reside inside them. It is not simply because they are not working hard enough, not intelligent enough, not gritty enough, not hustling enough, or not resilient enough. It is not them. Healing education is education that helps people identify and name historical and contemporary oppression as the problem. And making this oppression well-being connection will help address many of the damages of this sick world, like self-blame and victim blaming, as well as feelings of inferiority or inadequacy and low self-esteem. But not only these, making this connection also challenges existing systems, as it clearly and accurately points toward systems as the root of many problems. Making this kind of connection also directs us to see beyond ourselves and also see other people who are like us, which leads me to the third connection. We must connect our individual experiences of oppression with those of others in our own community. This type of connection helps us realize that we're not weird. Just as importantly, it helps us realize that we're not alone. It helps us see our connection with other people in our own group who are struggling with the same identity issues, self-doubts, and feelings of inferiority as we are. This type of connections helps us feel validated. It helps us realize that our confusions, difficulties, pain, anger, sadness, and sometimes feelings of desolation and despair are legitimate responses to a sick, oppressive world. This might address one of the most critical damages of a sick world, which is horizontal or lateral oppression. This not only helps us connect with others in our own group, but it also connects us with our ancestors. So in addition to addressing the damages of a sick world, this connection also gives us strength as it reminds us of the strength and resilience of our peoples and of our ancestors. And I want to combine this with connection number 2 real quick, which asks us to look for factors outside of us to explain many of the issues that we face. So extending that idea, we can also break free from the individualistic worldview by looking outside of us for strength. And here we can look at our own peoples, our own ancestors, and our long histories of survival and thriving in success, despite systematic attempts to erase us and deny us of our humanity as our most important source of strength. Strength doesn't have to just come from inside us. Strength doesn't have to be just an individual level factor. Strength can also come from outside of us, from our communities. And so to me, education that will help us break away from blaming ourselves, right, for being not resilient enough. That's healing education. And that's what we need. We need education that will shift us away from looking inside ourselves for resilience. A healing education is education that will teach us that our resilience is already a fact. Healing education is education that will reinforce the truth that the fact that we are here and our peoples are still here, despite generations of systematic attempts to erase us, is already proof of our resilience. We can find resilience in our communities and our ancestors in our histories. And knowing that our ancestors and our communities are with us, that we are never alone, gives us the strength and courage to make systemic level changes. And now for the next connection, making connections between our community's experiences of oppression with those of other communities. This is similar to connection 3, but here we go beyond our own groups, right? And if we gain strength and bravery from making within group connections, what we gain from between groups connections is power. Between groups connections, make movements towards systemic level changes formidable. By coming together and seeing our connections with each other, we really defeat internalized oppression's effect of horizontal or lateral violence and hostility. We defeat oppression's attempts to pit us against each other and divide us and conquer us. Making between groups connections allow us to more accurately diagnose the problem of oppression as a complex, multifaceted sickness and attack it more accordingly and more effectively. As Assata Shakur stated, any community seriously concerned with its own freedom has to be concerned about other people's freedom as well. The victory of oppressed people anywhere in the world is a victory for all oppressed people. Each time one of imperialism's tentacles is cut off, we are closer to liberation. Imperialism is an international system of exploitation, and we, as revolutionaries, need to be internationalists to defeat it. So connections 3 and 4 speak to moving beyond our own individual selves and seeing our connections with other people. This really is a challenge to the westernized, individualistic, and vertical worldview, a worldview and value system that has been imposed on us and has damaged us. So to me, a healing education is one that shifts toward a more collectivistic, horizontal worldview. For me, this worldview is consistent with the Filipino worldview that was erased and replaced by colonialism. Let me share that with you all real quick. According to distinguished Filipino psychologist Virgilio Enriquez, kapwa is the core concept in Filipino personhood. It means fellow human being and how we are connected and equal to our fellow human beings, right? It is the core Filipino value that one should not separate or differentiate oneself from others. To lose kapwa is to damage or lose one's personhood, humanity, and Filipino-ness. Okay. So going back to the damages of a sick, oppressive world, one such all-encompassing damage is internalized oppression. And, internalized oppression, a big part of it involves the oppressed person becoming so much like the oppressor that the oppressed even begins to adopt the oppressor's prejudiced attitudes. Therefore, one effect of internalized oppression is the desire to separate oneself from others who are perceived as inferior or less. So what's happened is that this sick, oppressive world has created deep, core-shattering damages on my peoples and other colonized peoples. So in essence, colonialism has damaged our worldviews and forced us to see ourselves as separate from others. Oppression has led us to lose connection with others. And so to put all of these connections together, a healing education, in my view, is the type of education that will restore and strengthen kapwa. A healing education is education that will foster connection between me and my ancestors. A healing education is education that will foster connection between me and the world around me. education that will foster connection between me and other people in other groups. A healing education is not the type of education that will try to train me to separate myself from others. A healing education is education that does not try to train me to be superior to other people or defeat them or to compete with them. A healing education does not focus on teaching me how to have control over resources and people and how to exploit them for profit or how to capitalize on them. A healing education is education that does not try to socialize me into believing that I am more special or exceptional than others. Instead, a healing education is the type of education that will help me create, maintain, and strengthen my bonds with other people. A healing education is the type of education that will help me understand that other people's success is my success, and that my success is other people's success, and that I'm not well if others are not well, and that I'm not healthy if this world is not healthy, that I'm not free from oppression if others are not free from oppression. And so in summary, emancipatory education is education that heals. And a healing education is one that facilitates historical and contemporary connections, oppression, well-being connections, within group connections, and between group connections. So in conclusion, I would like to acknowledge that many of my suggestions I made here today, and perhaps even more so, the visions of the other distinguished thought leaders who have spoken in the series, many of them may be perceived as far-fetched or too risky. So I want to end with this. Many of us here, if not all of us, are highly educated people. We've, over our years in college and beyond, we've learned a lot already. So we have lots of knowledge already. But nevertheless, knowledge doesn't necessarily correlate with action. As James Baldwin said, many of us know better. But as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. And I think many of us here know better, and now it's a matter of acting on what we know. I understand that many of us feel powerless and vulnerable. Many of us here are students, or maybe junior faculty, or people who are not in positions of privilege or power. And so acting on what we know might be too hard and too risky. Many of us might feel like we don't have a choice but to play the game right now and just survive it. And hopefully later get to a point in our lives where we have enough power to then act on what we know. I hear that, I understand that. So for those who are in positions of power, a lot of significant systemic changes fall on you. I encourage you to risk your power and your privilege to act on what you know is better. And for all of you, please know and remember that if you commit to act on what you know, if you take a risk and put yourself in danger to do what you know is right, please know and remember that there are many of us with you. You're not alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really powerful. From the deeply personal to an incredibly powerful framework to that call to action at the end, which resonated strongly. And I'm grateful on an individual personal basis and grateful on behalf of our community for your willingness to engage with us today and to have that really critical conversation that is particularly important at this time. I want to introduce a couple of people. We had some questions that people submitted as they were registering. And so I want to introduce a great future educator. Alberto Camacho is a student with us in our credential program, preparing to become a high school teacher, and was also a co-researcher in our Faces of Learning project last year. And Marcos Pizarro is our Associate Dean in the College of Education, as well as a professor in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies here at San Jose State. So they are going to share some of the questions that were submitted.
Thank you, Professor Latimer. It's an honor to be here and share some space with y'all. The first question that's on the list is, how can we do better with valuing and incorporating community knowledge and positioning it as a scholarly in its own right?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. I think we in the academy, we in the field of, education, we in universities and colleges, especially those of us who are in power to make changes. I think we need to really challenge um, our definition of what is legitimate knowledge, right? And also related to that, our definition of what we consider to be legitimate ways of generating knowledge or legitimate ways of collecting information or data. At least, in my field of psychology, as I alluded to earlier, we really are very, I guess, preoccupied with trying to appear scientific and trying to, appear objective. And, and because of that, we have limited ourselves into, a very narrow, I guess, range of methods that we consider to be legit, right? And so then, other forms of knowing, other forms of collecting information, other methods that are perhaps more indigenously compatible and natural for different communities. Those kinds of methods are regarded as less valid. And that the information obtained through those methods are regarded as less valid as well. And so for us, I think in the academy, we need to challenge that and change that. And we need to expand what we consider to be legit methodologies, we consider to be legit forms of collecting information. So that's one. Two, we need to reinforce that. We need to set up a system that will reward that and encourage that, right? Right now, many researchers are, trying to survive in universities, and the way that you survive in universities is by publishing. And right now, what the easiest, quickest way to publish is to just follow norms, to follow the status quo, because you will face fewer questions, you will face fewer barriers. You don't have to spend as much time trying to justify why you're using this methodology and so on, right? So, so that's the easiest way. So the system is set up right now to just continually strengthen the status quo. And so then systemic changes need to be made, to encourage different ways of doing things, right? So perhaps, you can reward researchers for doing community engaged work. You can reward researchers for doing collaborative work, right? Even though that might take longer, because doing collaborative work takes longer with communities, right? Because you need to gain communities' trusts, and you need to, incorporate community input in every phase of the project. So that might take longer, right? So that might mean you have less publications, right? But, our universities then must change and must accommodate that, and perhaps put more weight on that kind of work. And then lastly, I want to say, community leaders, community members, their knowledge need to be valued. And what I mean by that is we need to value it like we value academic knowledge. And how do we value academic knowledge? We pay people. So we should pay, our community advisors. We should show them, we should pay our cultural advisors, to really value it. And we need a system set up to show that valuation. So those are just some thoughts. Good question.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful and powerful. I'm wondering, I know we're running a little behind. I wonder if we have time for one more question. I'm gonna.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Go
Alberto,
for
I
it.
have one. I have one, but if you have one, you can go.
No, go ahead, Profe.
Okay, so I was thinking, I really appreciate your presentation and thinking about some of my own challenges, and I was wondering how you balance highlighting issues of like white supremacy, racism, and intersectional oppression, and at the same time being able to highlight the beauty, the power, the intelligence of BIPOC communities, particularly the Filipinx community. You know, and it feels like we're always kind of like in tension there, and so I just wanted to see if you could kind of play with that a little bit.
Mhm. I think, yeah, that's an excellent question. But that's a constant struggle, right? That's a constant struggle. You know, on one hand, um, you do want to deal with the realities, and that the realities are bleak. The realities are dark. The realities are, you know, pretty depressing even, right? You know, and so you don't want to come off as being hopeless, right? You know, but at the same time, being being part of the communities that we're parts of, you know, we understand that our communities also are beautiful and that they're strong, right? And there's so much resilience in there, right? But at the same time, you don't want to, like I was saying earlier, you don't want to just highlight those good things and say, let's not talk about the bad things. You see what I mean? And so to me, what helps me with that is, you know, I just try to, you know, remind myself that, well, that's what makes us all complete human beings. You know, the fact that we have dark sides and we have imperfections and we have flaws and we have problems, you know, while at the same time, you know, we have strengths and we have beauty. You know, that makes us complete, nuanced, complex people like we are. And that's really, to me, that's what we're trying to get at, right? We don't want society to see us as flat, one-dimensional people. You know what I mean? And I think, you know, getting to that reality and to that truth, you know, and as messy and as painful and as confusing that might be, that's the truth. Yeah, so I don't know. I that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, no,
Excellent question, but it's a constant struggle. It is
Yeah.
a constant struggle.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And we're gonna just, again, big thanks. I appreciate your analysis and your insights and the wisdom you're bringing from your communities to ours. So thank you so much, and Alberto, for the awesome question that got us started here. Back to Heather.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time, the thoughtfulness with which you approached the question that we put to you a while ago, but that it felt like the timing was such that you were speaking very much to the moment, and appreciate the being in community with us today. So thank you. And we hope that we will continue to be in community in moving forward. We'd love to continue to learn from your wisdom.